Okay, I'm going to get us started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to National Philanthropic Trust's new webinar, How to Support Your Clients' Giving in the Time of COVID-19. We put this together because this has been a year that has been marked by uncertainty, and we're hoping this webinar is going to offer you ways to connect with your clients and provide them with the most effective giving strategies. These strategies are designed not only to help your clients have a greater impact on society, but to improve their own sense of well-being as they become an active part of funding and achieving solutions. My name is Arielle Bruce. I'm with National Philanthropic Trust, and I'll be moderating today. First, I want to do a bit of housekeeping. All of our attendees will be muted automatically today in our presentation so that we can keep our presenters on track. But that said, we absolutely welcome your questions and we'll do our best to answer them. Your questions really help us have a productive discussion. To submit a question, you can locate the Q&A section in your webinar screen. It should be in the top right corner. It looks like a little chat box with a question mark. Send us your question at any point over the course of this presentation, and our presenters will answer them at the end. We will be sending around the slides following this presentation, so please don't feel like you have to take frantic notes. You will be able to refer back to the slides later on your own time. We will also include contact information for our two presenters along with our website so you can reach out later or do your own research. With all that said, I'm going to move on to introducing our two presenters for today. So Jeff Gerald, CFP, CEPA, is the Senior Director of Development for National Philanthropic Trust based in Austin, Texas. He leads the team of regional directors across the nation and covers the Southwest himself. Jeff has worked in advanced charitable planning for over a decade. His experience includes a broad spectrum of charitable contributions such as oil and gas wells, real estate, and private company stock. Jeff, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be here.
I'm also going to introduce Jenna Mulhall-Brereton, who is NPT's Chief Philanthropic Services Officer. She leads the team delivering services to premier level donors, as well as fiscal sponsorship, supporting organization administration, and a range of customized services to enable NPT's donors to develop and execute on their philanthropic vision. Jenna has advised individuals, families, and foundations on all aspects of philanthropic endeavors, from taking the first steps to defining their grant-making strategy to launching collaboratives with other donors. Good morning, Jenna.
Good morning, Arielle. Thanks for the introduction.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Jeff to take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, Arielle. I appreciate that. So good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Let's just cover the agenda briefly about what we're going to talk about. So today we intend to cover giving in this moment, your clients' questions, how you can support your clients, and how NPT can support you. So while most of you are familiar with how donor advised funds work, at the appropriate time, I'll give you a brief 30-second review. But more than anything, we will focus on how to make the best use of a donor advised fund to meet your clients' giving needs in today's environment. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jenna.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks so much to all of you who have joined us today. Wish we could all be in a room together, but we're happy to do the next best thing. And just want to start off by saying that those of you who may have already helped your clients set up a donor advised fund know that this is a really flexible and powerful giving tool that they have at their disposal that can be really easy to use at moments like this. But whether or not your clients do have a donor advised fund or another philanthropic vehicle, we recognize that a number of them are looking for advice right now on how to put their money to work. And we recognize that your job is to be there for them as they seek that guidance, and our job is to be there for you. So with that, I would like to just move on to the next slide and show you a little snapshot of what we're seeing. We have been so encouraged at NPT to see the grants that your clients are recommending for COVID relief. And this ranges from grants to support food distribution for the most vulnerable to grants supporting R&D for vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. We've also seen a huge upswell of grants in general, not just those specifically marked for COVID. So I think there's great awareness out there that most nonprofits are struggling right now, and it's really clear to us that your clients want to do their part. So now I'm going to turn it back to Jeff.
Thanks, Jenna. So when we think about why should you get involved in giving, let's think about what value means in an advisory relationship. Well, it's easy to measure the quantitative aspects of financial management, such as assessing portfolio performance against benchmarks and determining the success of meeting financial goals. But qualitative, emotional outcomes like connection or peace of mind, and most importantly, trust, are equally important. How do you support your clients emotionally? One important way is to help them have an impact today, in this moment, and in this period of crisis, as well as in the future, on the causes that matter most to them. Studies show that the vast majority of your clients, 79%, say that you play an important role in their charitable giving, and the majority expect you to raise the topic during your first several meetings. Simply put, people want advice from other people. So as we move on, let's briefly review what a donor advised fund is. Donor advised funds are simply programs run by a public charity, National Philanthropic Trust. So when you contribute cash or long-term capital gain property, either publicly traded stocks, bonds, mutual funds, or ETFs, or privately held shares in a private company, you avoid capital gain tax, you generate a fair market value deduction. Those assets are then sold by the charity with no capital gains tax associated. They can then be invested, they grow gift and estate tax free, and then granted to the charity at the time of the donor's recommendation, thereby separating the timing of the tax deduction from the ongoing grants to the charity. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and how to incorporate that into a financial plan. So with that brief review, let's talk a little bit about the timeliness and power of donor advised fund giving today. This crisis, as well as any of the more recent natural disasters, has highlighted that the public health crises require flexible, responsible, charitable support. And with a donor advised fund, this is an opportunity to weatherproof your clients' giving by helping them contribute assets when it makes the most sense financially. For example, when they're experiencing a significant taxable event, like a bigger bonus than normal, or they've sold a business, and then helping your clients grant them out when the need is greatest, thereby helping them take advantage of assets that are well appreciated, but essentially creating an endowment-like savings account so that they can give over a period of time. So as we move on, now that we've talked a little bit about timeliness and power, let's talk specifically about what the stimulus bill means for donors and how we can help. So the stimulus bill did two things. When Congress passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, also known as CARES, it increased the limitation on cash donations to qualified charities from 50 or 60% of adjusted gross income to 100% of adjusted gross income. And it also allowed donors who take the standard deduction to deduct $300 in cash contributions to qualified charities. However, donor advised funds, support organizations, and private foundations are exempt from the newly expanded deduction cap. So it may be the case that a donor can exercise these limits by stacking their giving, still being able to deduct up to 60% of their adjusted gross income in contributions to donor advised funds, but then also being able to deduct any additional direct contributions to a charitable organization up to the 100% limit. So let's now take a look at how that might work. So when we think about stacking deductions, as you see in this diagram, it really is an opportunity for your clients. If you look on the left-hand side, if you contribute cash only, you could contribute 60% of your adjusted gross income to a donor advised fund and then give 40% directly to public charities. If you consider the advantages of contributing long-term capital gain property, which provides a dual tax benefit of capital gains avoidance and federal income tax reduction, you could contribute 30% to a long-term capital gain, 30% of your adjusted gross income to a donor advised fund, and then contribute 70% in cash to public charities, thereby reaching the 100% limit. So one of the things that we want to think about is that this is this is my opportunity to make my joke of, I'm not a CPA and I don't play one on TV. So don't forget, National Philanthropic Trust is not a tax firm, so we should always encourage your clients, our donors, to consult with their own tax advisors to make decisions on these matters. So ultimately, one of the benefits here is to think about how do we reduce or avoid taxation and take those savings and give it to the charitable causes they care about, while thinking about how and where your clients want to give. So as we move on, let's think about what those questions that may be coming up in your client's mind. So you may have already heard from your clients seeking answers in this uncertain time. What we want to do in this next section is review a series of questions that you may have already heard, or you may be likely to hear in the future. They may be asking about how to give, where to give, and if these new circumstances are going to affect their personal positions. These questions are really arranged to address the lifespan of a donor advised fund, from opening to contributing cash or long-term capital gain property, including private company stock, the investment aspects of donor advised funds, and then ultimately to grant making, which is the reason donor advised funds exist. So we've gathered a number of common ones, but if you're hearing any others, I'll just mention again, don't hesitate to use the Q&A section to send your questions in, and we're happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So as we move on to fielding your clients' questions, what are the best assets to contribute to a donor advised fund in a down market? Well, one of the things that we know, the fact that we hear this often lately, is the stock market is not the economy, and the economy is not the stock market. There are still sectors of the stock market that have substantial appreciation. So as we think about it, think about sectors that have done well over the last year or the last 10. Think about your clients that are still selling their business. That could be a privately held business. It could include restricted stock. Or if they've inherited property with an unknown basis. Those are all opportunities to help your clients contribute, capture a fair market value deduction, avoid the capital gains tax, and then benefit from a federal income tax reduction. So I'll just note quickly, as you do portfolio reviews, it's always a good opportunity to say if a position has outgrown your original percentage allocation, that's an opportunity to take that portion of the position, contribute it to a donor advised fund, thereby taking what you might have considered to be a tax event and turn it into a tax deduction. So as we think about what's next, let's move on to the next question. So one of the things that the CARES Act did was to extend the tax deadline from April 15th to July 15th. So the question you may be hearing, if your clients did contribute any privately held asset, so that's any asset not traded on the stock exchange, does that give them more time to either file and or get the qualified appraisal? We'll just mention briefly that the real deadline, as always, is the earlier of the tax filing deadline, which is now July 15th, or when the taxpayer actually files. So the extension deadline is still October 15th, but now it's just simply 3 months away from July 15th. So bottom line is, yes, you get more time. Don't forget, the deadline is whenever your client files, up to and including tax filing extensions. As we move on, to the next question, can I reallocate my donor advised fund investments at any time to meet my grant making needs? I'll just mention that since investments are considered the property of the donor advised fund or a public charity, reallocating amongst areas of the stock market that have done well, if you have an investment in a pool or if you're using a segregated investment account, reallocating, you can do reallocations without any tax drag. So don't hesitate to make sure that your client's donor advised fund portfolio meets their portfolio giving goals, and recognize that you can reallocate without any tax drag or no tax cost. So that's it for me for a moment. As we move on to the next question, I'm going to turn it back to Jenna to talk about grant making.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, the next few questions here have to do with grant making, so I'm going to take us through those. And our first one is, my priorities have shifted now that there's more urgent need, so how do I create a new grant making strategy? So first and foremost, one of the advantages, of course, of a donor advised fund is that you can pivot, you can change course at any time quite easily. So unlike with a foundation that might have a governing board and a set of grant making guidelines, your clients can adapt their grant making strategies very quickly with a donor advised fund. Now, I fully recognize that your clients might not yet think of their giving plan as a strategy or as a grant-making strategy. Their giving might be more ad hoc, and that's perfectly fine. But for those who want to think just a bit more strategically about where their philanthropic funds are going, even a very simple mission statement that identifies what motivates them to give and that puts a wrapper around their giving can be a really helpful guide. And that still allows for flexibility when a need arises that was unanticipated, like now. So building that simple mission statement really starts with asking a very simple question, which is, what is it you want to accomplish with your giving? So moving to the next question. If I decide to recommend more or more frequent grants at this time, what will that do to my long-range horizons? So this is definitely a moment when a lot of people are making gifts and recommending grants from their donor-advised funds to programs that were not even on their radar 8 weeks ago. And we see the same thing happen on a somewhat smaller scale after natural disasters. So I always think about, it can be really helpful for donors to think about their donor advised fund account as a portfolio with a certain percentage that's allocated for emergency response or other giving that comes up through the course of the year that they couldn't have necessarily anticipated. And having that percentage allocated for ad hoc needs as they come up allows donors to be responsive in the moment, but also to stay connected to their longer term goals and not worry about their overall giving budget. So if your clients are concerned right now about their longer term giving goals, it is a good idea to talk to them about making new contributions to their donor advised funds to keep their charitable savings on target for those goals. And that's going to be case by case if they decide to add more now or to spend down their donor advised funds and then make a larger contribution later when the market rebounds. And one more question on grant making on the next slide. How do I make sure I'm making a donation to a reputable charity and avoiding scams? So this is a question that that comes up a lot, and certainly not just at a time like this. And the short and simple answer is that for donors who are using a donor advised fund to make grants, there is some extra protection from scams in that our team does due diligence on every grant to ensure that the funds are going to a qualified charitable organization that's in good standing with the IRS. But it's absolutely true that scams do exist, and also true that in a crisis like this, there are going to be bad faith actors who will try to take advantage of the general uncertainty right now, the sense of urgency, and people's generous desire to give at this moment. So regardless of whether or not your clients have a donor advised fund, here's a few tips. And I think the first one is the most important. Your clients should never click, actually if we can go back to the slide before this, just adding a few more notes on, thanks. Your clients should never click on a donate now button straight from an email, and especially an unsolicited email. Instead, they should navigate to the organization's website to learn more about their work, and only then should they decide whether or not to make a contribution. If they want to go deeper, they can spend some time exploring social media channels for that organization as well. And if there's no social media presence, or if that branding is inconsistent with the website, those could be red flags. And if your client wants to go a little bit deeper, they can actually always use an online resource like Candid by GuideStar or Charity Navigator to learn more about the organization's history and financial data. Okay, now moving to that next slide. So we all recognize that there's a great deal of need out there right now, and people definitely have questions specifically about how and where to give. So just want to offer a few final pieces of advice about grant making at this moment in time. So first, think globally, because if ever there was an issue that showed us how interconnected we all are, this is certainly it. And if there's a charitable organization overseas that your client would like to support, NPT can facilitate those international grants. And the second piece of advice, also look closer to home, because we're all seeing urgent needs right now in our own communities. And NPT can help connect your clients to resources to help them deploy their grant making to organizations that are responding on the ground close to home. And finally, the third point, give without restriction. So donors can always request that stipulations be put on grants that define what the funds can be used for. And NPT is always really happy to help donors with those requests. But this is a really unique moment in time when charitable organizations value flexible support now more than ever. And so for those organizations that your clients know and trust, and I want to stress those that they know and trust, it's a great time to recommend unrestricted grants that enable organizations to shift priorities in real time to meet urgent needs. And finally, the last point I'll make here is that your clients can set up recurring grants in the online donor portal, and this is a nice way to provide their favorite charitable organizations with a reliable income stream at this uncertain time. Now we're going to talk about how you can be there for your clients right now with regard to their philanthropy, and I'm going to hand it off to Jeff for a moment.
Thanks, Jenna. So let's talk for a few moments about a few strategies that you can use to support your clients. So reimagining bundling for a moment is really just an opportunity to help your clients reach the threshold to itemize, because with the last Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, it's become harder for people to move beyond the standard deduction. So what we want to think about is bundling is really bundling multiple years of your client's charitable giving into 1 year. Just like you imagine gathering firewood to build a fire, as you pick up, say, 3 or 4 sticks or 3 or 4 years of your charitable giving, it allows them to meet the threshold for itemization, thereby taking a bigger deduction than they would if they were just taking the standard. So then, if we think about what that means, the other way I'll just say briefly is, I also think about this as accelerating future years of charitable giving into the current year. So if we move on to estate planning, there's no better time to discuss the big ideas of a client's life than when you're handling their estate planning. So if you're helping clients think about how they want to support their family members, or even bigger reaching ideas about legacy, the legacy they want to leave, a charitable vehicle like a donor advised fund could be the tool you need to help them achieve that legacy. So where does this start? It really starts with trying to understand what your clients' values are and their goals beyond their money. So I'll just simply notate that the more context you have for those estate planning strategies, the more context you have for their estate planning strategies, the more you can make their plan relevant to what their goals are. And if you're looking for resources about how to have that philanthropic conversation, I'd encourage you to check out our Donor Advice Fund Insights for Advisors blog series, where you can find anecdotes, resources, checklists, so that you can, on a regular basis, connect with your clients' philanthropy to ensure that their philanthropic mission and vision is connected to their goals. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jenna.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to talk about some strategies for giving back that are pretty popular right now that your donors may be looking to employ. So while a donor advised fund can be an incredibly powerful tool for giving, they are subject to a number of IRS regulations governing their use, and so they may not be best suited for every scenario. Here's a couple of ways that we think people are looking to think about giving back right now, and some alternate strategies you might want to suggest with regard to their donor advised funds. So first, a combination of social distancing and the economy, of course, have put a lot of people, and especially service workers, out of their jobs right now. And one of the most common ways to give right now is to contribute to direct aid, either in the form of writing a check to a local family in need, or contributing to, say, a GoFundMe for the servers at a local restaurant. And it's important to keep in mind that the IRS does not permit donor advised funds to make payments to specific individuals. However, if a donor can identify a qualified charity that gives direct aid to local families, or, for example, that support to local restaurant workers, where they can recommend a grant from their donor advised fund to that organization, so to that charitable organization. And I would note that community foundations are a great resource for this kind of local support. And the next one is with regard to the fact that museums and performance venues and all kinds of cultural institutions have been really hit hard by the social distancing that we're experiencing, of course, as well. And a common request by these institutions at this moment is to renew your membership, because this is a way to ensure that the organizations have a reliable source of support. Similarly, lots of nonprofits have springtime galas or other fundraising events that have had to be canceled, and they're pivoting to request that people still attend those events virtually with a donation of what would have been the cost of a ticket. So grants of this nature, with regard to membership campaigns and these types of fundraising events, are often flagged because the IRS does not permit a donor to pay for dues or membership fees or event tickets if the donor receives more than an incidental benefit. However, a donor can still make a grant to support the fundraising efforts of their favorite nonprofits, as long as they waive in writing all of the benefits associated with the specific event or with the campaign or membership drive. So we've talked a little bit about how you can be there for your clients when it comes to their philanthropy, and now we're going to talk about how NPT as your partner can be there for you. So on this slide, we're showing the landing page for NPT's COVID-19 response and resources. And from our homepage, you'll see a banner that will take you to this landing page. When the outbreak first began in China, we created a document of curated organizations that donors could support. And since then, we've continued to update and expand resources for donors as they become available. So this is a good site to come back to from time to time. And I also just want to remind you that NPT now and always provides philanthropic advisory services. So no matter where your clients are on their philanthropic journey, we can work with them at all stages in the process. So starting with providing support to define that mission statement we were talking about earlier, or helping donors learn about a particular issue or explore potential grantees. We're happy to do all of that. And we provide the really tactical support as well, such as working with donors to create customized grant agreements. And finally, I'll note that we also enjoy partnering with wealth advisors to help you have fruitful conversations with your clients about philanthropy. And I also just want to note, we've noticed in recent years, we've been really encouraged to see the interest that donors have in pooling resources to create bigger impact. And we're certainly seeing this bear out at this moment in time with regard to COVID-19. So as a reminder, we do offer multiple ways for donors to collaborate and to work together, and whether that's through a donor advised fund or other vehicle. So we can help you and your clients evaluate and select the right charitable vehicle for their collaboration. And with that, I am going to hand it back to Jeff to take us over the finish line.
Thanks, Jenna. That's really good information to share. So what I want you to take from this slide, as you see, this is a map of the regional directors, where we're located, and the states we cover. Ultimately, I just want you to know that we seek to help you help your clients give in whatever way makes sense for them. So if you have questions or concerns, comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to the regional director in your area. We are here to help you help your clients give. So as we move on to the last slide, we just always want to say, we know there is choice in this world, and why you should use NPT really for me comes down to this. Our mission is to increase philanthropy in society. And National Philanthropic Trust is a public charity. We were founded in 1996, and we've become recognized leaders. But most importantly, we are more than just a donor advised fund. We believe we're truly a suite of philanthropic solutions designed to help your clients give in whatever way makes sense for them, so that we fulfill our mission. So if we can help you help your clients do that, please call us. So with that, I'll just say on behalf of Jenna and I, thank you for being here today. We'll turn it over to Ariel for any questions that we may have.
Thanks, Jeff. And as a reminder to all of our attendees, you can use that question and answer function in the top right-hand corner of your webinar screen to submit a question. I'm going to ask first a question from Bob. Can you leave your estate or a portion of your estate to a donor advised fund? And if so, one, does it qualify for the estate tax charitable deduction? And two, who controls the grants after you're dead? So maybe Jeff, you can take that first portion, and Jenna, you can take that second portion.
That sounds good, Ariel, thanks. And Bob, thanks for the question. It's a great one. So absolutely, you can leave a portion of your estate to a donor advised fund, and it definitely qualifies for an estate tax charitable deduction. I'll mention that if you're thinking about planning and you have choices between taxable assets and tax-deferred assets like an IRA can be a great type of account to name a donor advised fund as the beneficiary, especially if your clients are over 70 and a half and taking MRDs. MRDs can create income in respect of a decedent after your client dies. If they're taking MRDs, naming a charity like a donor advised fund retains flexibilities for your heirs to give that money away, or whoever you name, and Jenna can talk about that in a moment, whoever you name to continue your client's legacy, but also avoid that income tax I just mentioned and generate a charitable deduction for the estate. Jenna, do you want to talk about successors a little bit, or who controls after a donor's
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So after death, I think, and every donor advised fund might offer different options, so I'll speak to NPT. Donors have the option to think about their legacy plan, either when they're setting up their donor advised fund or later, and can always adapt it over time. But it's very possible to set up an individual or a number of individuals as successors to the primary advisors on the account. So this would be someone who could recommend grants after the death of the primary and or joint advisor. Sometimes we find donors like the option of then splitting a DAF into, say, 2 donor advised funds, and they might have a child be the primary advisor of each of those. And there's other options as well, such as designating that the balance of your donor advised fund will go out in lump sums to certain charities upon your death. And there's other more customized options such as an endowment, but basically a lot of different options to explore. So it's certainly worth having a conversation about.
Great. We've got one other question from someone who asks that their client is very, very philanthropic and is looking for the best way to go forward, but is kind of waffling between choosing a private foundation for their family philanthropy or a donor advised fund, and is wondering if you can speak to the pros and cons of each.
I'll jump on that one if that's okay. So that's a great question, and it's something that I often hear in this particular context where they ask, well, how much money do I need to start a private foundation? Or when should I really start thinking about a private foundation versus a donor advised fund? And it often references a dollar amount. I might hear, well, you really need $5 million before you consider a private foundation. And I'll just simply say, when I was doing financial planning, I never thought about solutions in terms of how much money they were going to put into a solution. It always starts with the goal. And that's how I would encourage you to think about this particular question as well. What's your client's goal for whatever philanthropic dollars they're setting aside to benefit society? And as we drill down into that goal, we can start to understand what are the tools and resources that your client might need in order to fully realize whatever their vision is. I've had that conversation, and I'm happy to help with that, but that's where it comes down to, what do they want to do with the money, and what solution, a private foundation or a donor advised fund, is really best suited to help them think about that. And just briefly, you can think about that in each aspect of a donor advised fund lifespan, from what assets do they have to contribute. For example, if they own a private company stock and it's about to be sold, you can only contribute private company stock to a donor advised fund or a public charity and generate a fair market tax deduction. You cannot do that to a private foundation. Then, as we think about the investments and the grant making, both those things hold true as well. So happy to get into that a little bit further, but I hope that answers the question that ultimately it's the goal or the mission and vision of your client's philanthropy that drives whether or not a private foundation or a donor advised fund makes sense. Jenna, would you add anything to that?
I think that was great, Jeff. I think maybe the only other thing I would add is the degree to which your client wants to be involved in the administration. And some people might want to be really roll their sleeves up and hire staff and manage the administration. And some people might prefer to have all the administrative needs met, say, by a donor advised fund, but to stay really connected and involved in the grant making. So that's just another consideration.
Oh, that's a great point. I agree.
Great. So this is a somewhat related question, I think, to this idea of a private foundation versus a DAF. We have a question from someone who says that they have a client who wants to kind of be more formal about their philanthropy, but really wants to set up the next generation, wants to involve their children, and he's wondering if there are any specific formal structures that you can use with a DAF to set stuff up for the next generation.
So I'll jump in here, Jeff, if you don't mind. I love talking about bringing the next generation on board. And I would say there's a mix of formal and informal things that you need to implement. First and foremost, I think bringing in the next generation as early as possible in some kind of capacity is really useful. I think of it like training wheels. Don't just expect to suddenly hand everything off one day and expect that the next generation will be ready to carry on the philanthropic legacy, but instead allow them to have some degree of autonomy with regard to, say, making a certain number of grant recommendations every year, or being part of family meetings. Certainly, I know some families that will have come together as a family to decide on grant recommendations, even if they don't have a foundation. I mean, they could do that because they want to make grant recommendations from their donor advised fund, or even if they're doing checkbook philanthropy, but want to come together and make decisions as a family. And I would say giving the next generation some autonomy, perhaps some amount of budget that they can have some purview over is a really good way to start. And then, just kind of incrementally bring them along. And for those who have a foundation, I would say think about making them board members. But even if you don't, there's ways to think about your decision making and how you give as a family that really creates some space for the next generation to get involved.
All right, we have one more question coming in that is about charitable lead trusts. Somebody read somewhere recently that the rates are pretty favorable right now and wants to know if there's a way to kind of incorporate a charitable lead trust and a DAF in their estate planning.
I think it's a great question. I think charitable lead trusts can be fascinating solutions. And I'll just mention briefly that when you think about a charitable remainder trust or charitable lead trusts, donor advice funds absolutely qualify to be either the remainder beneficiary or the lead in the charitable lead trust. So you might say, okay, well, I understand they qualify. Why would I do it? Because in most states, not all, and again, I'm not an attorney, but in most states, changing the charitable let me back up. In most states, if you wanted to change the charitable remainder or the lead, it would require a court trip where the charity would have to, if you named a charity specifically, they would have to give up their rights in order for the donor advised fund to be substituted. So a donor advised fund retains that flexibility, qualifies as a qualified beneficiary, but also allows the future generation to give to whatever charity they are currently interested in. Because as CLTs are generally for a period of a term specific, generally no more than 20 years, those charities that are named in documents can change. Leadership can evolve. Or the family may just have moved on to a different cause that they care about. So donor advised funds can be a great way to retain flexibility, qualify as the beneficiary, but also allow for multiple goals without the headache of having to go to court.
Okay, well, on that note, I think I'm going to be signing off. Thank you again, Jeff and Jenna, for taking the time. We want to thank all of you, also all of the attendees, for joining us today and sharing your valuable time for this discussion.